Welcome to the How to Prevent Financial Fraud at Your Church webinar, presented by Church Executive Magazine and Guide One Insurance. I'm Rayanne Slaybaugh, Editor-in-Chief of Church Executive Magazine. Church Executive is the go-to business resource for senior pastors, executive pastors, and business administrators at the largest churches and megachurches in America. We reach nearly 45,500 of the most influential church leaders in the country. We are honored to have Guide One as our partner. Guide One provides comprehensive insurance coverage that addresses the unique needs of churches, synagogues, and other houses of worship, with risk management solutions that allow them to practice their faith with confidence. Throughout the webinar, please submit questions via the question and answers box on your screen. The final 15 minutes of the webinar will be dedicated to a Q&A session. We'll cover as many questions as possible in the time allotted, but if your question is not answered, it will be shared with the Guide One team to follow up. Our moderator today is Eric Spacek, Director of Risk Management and Loss Control at Guide One. I'm pleased to turn the program over to Eric.
Thank you, Rayanne, and good morning, everyone. We want to thank you for joining us for this risk management webinar on the subject of preventing financial fraud. Sadly, it's not unusual for us to see headlines and claims involving the misuse or misappropriation of funds at houses of worship. I was just reading a newspaper article about a financial secretary at a church who recently pled guilty to larceny after writing and cashing 289 checks made payable to herself over a 6-year period. She had access to blank checks that were signed by the treasurer and commented that, quote, "he trusted me." While that scheme was pretty simple and the loss, $37,000, could have been worse given the circumstances, it brings up the issue of internal controls that we've part of the discussion this morning. I should note that this webinar is intended to provide general information on preventing financial fraud. You're encouraged to consult with your own CPA, attorney, or other financial professional for an opinion specific to your situation. I'm very pleased this morning to introduce our speaker, CPA and nonprofit consultant Vana Lau. Vana served 20 years with a certified public accounting firm specializing in service to nonprofit organizations. She's also served nonprofits in a variety of board and advisory positions and has published articles in National Church Business Administration publications, as well as co-authoring the book Essential Guide to Church Finances. Vana was inducted into the Church Management Hall of Fame of the Church Network, formerly known as the NACBA, in 2010. Her speaking experiences include a variety of regional seminars, as well as the national conferences of the Christian Leadership Alliance and the Church Network, where I've appreciated getting to know Vana and her heart for ministry. I'm excited to share the recent announcement that effective August 1st, 2017, Vana will join the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, or the ECFA, as an executive vice president. We hope to have a few minutes at the conclusion of the webinar to talk about Vana's new role at the ECFA and the services that that organization offers to churches. As Rayanne mentioned, please feel free to submit questions to us via the questions and answers or Q&A box on your screen. As the webinar progresses, after we've heard from Vana, we'll have the opportunity to answer as many of those questions as we're able to within the time allotted. Vana, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Eric. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this, and I appreciate Guide One and Church Executive providing a resource like this for churches and congregations across the country. I've shared my screen, so I'm hopeful that everyone can now see the presentation that we'll be walking through for the next little while. And this topic is so relevant to organizations. We think, oh, we're in the church, this doesn't happen, but as Eric said, it does happen, and we need to be prepared for that. So we have 3 things on our agenda today. One of those is why churches fall victim to fraud. The next one is financial control best practices. And then finally, recognizing and responding to financial fraud. Let's start with why churches fall victim to fraud, and I couldn't have asked for a better intro from Eric with the example that he provided, because the first thing I have up here is trust. And when I have gone into churches before and asked them about their internal controls or asked them what processes they have in place to protect the church, so many times their first response is, well, we trust our employees, or we trust our volunteers. Some of you, I'm sure, on this webinar have heard me speak on this topic or something similar, and you'll hear a few of the things that I've said before, because I think they're really important. And when it comes to the matter of trust, the thing that I say is that's a baseline. If you don't trust your employees or you don't trust your volunteers, you need to address that. So I would expect that you would trust everyone that's on staff or working with you. I had a friend that said, trust is not an internal control. And as we look at internal controls in a little bit, I think that you'll understand how true that is. We cannot rely on that alone. One of the other things is there is limited time and staff. I've got to believe that every one of you on this call would say there's not enough time to do all the things that need to be done. It's a very uncommon individual that would say, you know, I've really got too much time on my hands at work and I'm trying to figure out what I can do. So when we've got limited time and we have limited staff, it just means that sometimes we make shortcuts or we make mistakes. When those happen, it's an environment that becomes for fraud to actually occur. Next, the lack of controls. And again, we'll dig into that more deeply as we go through the next few slides. But because we have limited staff or limited volunteers, it's easy to say, oh, I don't have enough people to be able to have good internal controls. And you know, at one point years ago, I used to feel sorry for smaller organizations and have some sympathy and say, oh, I know you just don't have enough people to be able to do that. And then I saw organizations that maybe had a senior pastor and a church secretary, and they were able to do it. And so once I saw it done well in several places, I realized, you know what, we can't use that excuse anymore. We have to maybe be more creative about how we do it, and we include some volunteers, or we put different responsibilities on individuals maybe outside of what their primary role is. But there are ways that we can do it and that we can protect both the church and the individuals involved. So we'll talk about controls. Certainly a dynamic environment. You know, when we've got new personnel, we've got new software, maybe we're converting from one church management software program to another, or we've got significant growth, those are times when it is easier for fraud to occur. The new personnel, I always give this example of, remember when you were a kid and you used to play the telephone game? And so we'd line up and the first person would say a phrase, and we'd pass it from one person to the next to the next. And when it got to the end, remember, we all giggled really hard because it wasn't anything similar to what the initial phrase was. Well, that can happen with new personnel. We've got policies and procedures in place, and those work and they're effective. And then we train someone new, and then they leave and someone steps in on an interim basis, and then we get a full-time person to replace them. And pretty soon we're kind of 3 iterations down the road. And I think if we could look at it in a lighthearted way, we'd almost laugh at ourselves sometimes to see what happens to those processes along the way. So we have to be prepared for that. The new software, the point with that one is that when there is software changes, obviously that disrupts everything. We don't know how it works. There are mistakes. So it's just an uncertain environment. And during that transition time, it can lead to problems, either intentional or accidental. And then growth, obviously just trying to keep up. The last one I have on here is tone at the top. And I probably will reiterate this a number of times throughout here. But we need to realize that the tone at the top, our boards, our senior pastor, they are so critical. The tone that they set is what the other staff and the other volunteers will follow. And I realize that probably many of you on this call today are not the people in your organization that are setting that tone, but I would encourage them in as gentle a way as you can to help them understand the importance of that, because that's who people will follow. So those are some of the reasons why churches fall victim to fraud. Here's a fraud triangle, and I would guess that you've seen this as a simple version of it. You've probably seen it in other places or heard it discussed, but there are really 3 different pieces to fraud happening. as we've identified them here: opportunity, motivation, and rationalization. Just from those three words, I'm going to let you think for just a second. There's only one of them that you as church staff can actually have any control over. Which one of those three things would it be? If you said opportunity, you're absolutely correct. Rationalization, those are things like they owe it to me, I'm underpaid, I'm undervalued, I've worked here a long time, they haven't given me raises. Those are things that they're able to rationalize doing fraud. Motivation would be, they maybe have a spouse that recently lost a job. They may have significant medical needs in their immediate family. There's some motivation where they believe or truly do need additional funding. And so they've got a motivation to commit fraud. Opportunity is what we're giving them when we don't have good internal controls. When we're allowing them the opportunity to access these funds and let it go undetected. We cannot do much about motivation and rationalization, so we need to focus our efforts on opportunity, and that's exactly what we're going to do this morning. So let's walk through some financial control best practices. The purpose for having best practices in this area would be to protect the assets and the reputation of the church. We want to make sure that there isn't easy access to these things. And the reputation part of it is, unfortunately, whether the fraud is $300,000 or $300, if people in your church find out that funds were misappropriated, there is a significant reputational risk that you're facing. Because now people are going to wonder, when I give my tithes and offerings, is that actually being handled properly? And it may even, the case that was talked about this morning, I'm sure was in the paper. And so there's even the risk that this is going to become public. It'll be in newspapers or other media. People will discuss it. And then people outside of your church will have reputational concerns as well. So that's why we want to make sure we've done everything we can within reason to protect the church. We also want to protect the individuals involved. I worked with a church business administrator at one time that had left one church and was being considered for another position. And her requirement of that church was that they have an annual audit. And she said, I want to make sure that somebody else is looking over my shoulder. I'm going to be solely responsible for a lot of what happens here, and I want to make sure I'm protected. When we talk about reviewing expense reports and credit card statements, the biggest part of that is to protect the individual, both from tax consequences, but also from reputational risk. When someone makes an accusation in a church, you know better than I do how difficult it is to recover from that, even if it's not true. And so at least if we've got some good controls in place, we can usually stop those processes early on and say, you know, that couldn't have happened, and here's why. So we want to make sure that we protect those individuals. It also allows us to provide reliable financial information. Let me tell you, you don't want to be providing poor financial information that a board makes significant decisions on and then find out 6 weeks or 2 months down the road that, oh yeah, that wasn't quite accurate. We need to make sure that our systems are set up and that we've got good practices and controls in place to provide reliable information. The last two kind of go hand in hand, and that's good internal controls allow us to detect mistakes because they happen. I've been a CPA for 20 years, and you know what? On any given day, I've been able to book a journal entry backwards. We make mistakes, but when we have checks and balances in place, those will be detected and corrected quickly. It also allows us to detect financial misconduct. So the first piece of good internal controls is segregation of duties. We want to make sure that these three components of any given process are separated: custody, authorization, and record keeping. Now, the primary areas that I have here are cash receipts. Obviously, For most of you, that's contributions. That's your largest area. Cash disbursements, just paying the bills, and then payroll. Those are the main areas where funds come into and go out of your church. So as we look at those and we think about the custody, authorization, and record keeping, let's take just cash disbursements. I want to help you understand what I mean by that. So custody of the asset. In that case, it would be the check stock. Who has access to the check stock? Okay. The authorization would be the people that are the check signers. Who is authorized to pay funds out of that bank account? And then the record keeping is the individual who is keeping track of those funds in the accounting system, whether that's QuickBooks or, you know, one of the other larger packages. Who's doing that? We can have one person that does two pieces of that, but we don't want anyone that has access to all three. Now, I know that there are a few of you on this call that either knew before or just realized right now, oh, I'm the only one that does all of that. And that puts me at risk. So think through who else could be involved in one of those pieces. Maybe it's that you're not a check signer. You prepare the checks, they go to someone else, they get signed and sent out, and all you do is put them into the accounting system. Maybe it's that somebody else actually is involved in the record keeping. They do the bank reconciliations, look at the bank statements online or in paper, something like that. But really think about each of those areas, the cash receipts, payroll, and disbursements, and how you can separate out at least one of those areas so that someone on your staff or volunteer doesn't have access to all three. So here are just some specific processes that you could look at related to cash receipts. So dual custody of uncounted funds. We want to make sure that when the funds are gathered, that they're not in the custody of one person before they are counted. So we don't put them all together, give all the funds to the head usher who goes back to the office by himself, you know, counts them, or just drops them in an offering envelope and puts them in the safe. That gives that head usher the opportunity to take some of those funds. Let me, just a side note here, I go down rabbit trails, but I promise I don't go down far. One thing I want you to take out of today also is that we think about how easy it is to take cash. Let me tell you, it is very easy to misdirect checks as well. And when I give this talk, I always tell people, I am not telling you how to do fraud, so do not walk away from this session thinking that. But I need you to be more alert and more aware of how these things occur. So with checks, let's say that you're Abilene Bible Church. Well, that's ABC. It also would be very easy for someone that's a volunteer to set up just a personal DBA of Abigail's Beautiful Creations, and there you've got ABC as well. So if someone could write a check to ABC, and someone else could take that and deposit it into their bank account just as easily. So sometimes even taking checks and depositing through an ATM machine may allow them to not be checked as carefully. So really what I want you to understand is it's not just the cash that we have to take care of, it is the checks also. So we want to make sure that never do we have a person who has sole custody of uncounted funds. We also don't want someone to have sole access to the safe. So maybe you've even got a great system where you have a set of people that have the combination to the safe, and it's in a locked office that different people have keys to. That's great. It means it takes two people to get to that safe. You always want to consider that. Now, I also want you to step back for just a moment and think about, is there anyone who actually has access to both? I tend to ask the follow-up questions like that when I'm asking about processes in a church. And I did that one day in a larger church, and they were great. They had great control. These people have access to the safe. These people have access to the office it's in. There was no overlap. And I said, thinking about it, are you sure there's not a person who has the key to both? And the CFO looked at me and all of a sudden got this kind of panicked look and said, actually, the janitor has the backup key for both the safe and the office. Don't even know if the janitor realized it or not, but very easily may have. And that individual would have been the one who had full access to the safe. So really think about who that might be. The next one is restrictively endorsing checks as soon as possible. This ties in with what I was just talking about checks being easily diverted. Make sure that you've got a stamp that says for deposit only with the bank account information for the church. And when those checks come in, that's done as soon as possible. For many of you, I would hope that might even be Sunday. You know, even if it doesn't get counted, that those checks get stamped before they get dropped into the safe. If not, let's do it first thing Monday morning. But that helps protect against those checks being misdirected. So as soon as possible, getting those endorsed. Timely deposits. Let's not leave deposits in the bank or in the safe, till Wednesday or Thursday. Some of you are saying, are you kidding? We need the cash flow. It goes in the second we can get it in there. And others are saying, well, we get around to it at some point during the week. But making sure that we've just done that as timely as possible. Also, making sure that we do complete deposits. And by that, I mean it's very easy that we receive, funds for events or for even the Sunday offering, and we take some of the cash out of there because, well, we've got to pay for this, or we need to do this honorarium or something like that. And it's just as easy to take it out of here and we'll account for it. Let's not do that. Let's send things through the proper process. If we need to cut a check and have the right person approve that and sign it, that we do that so that we've got not only a proper accounting of things and we know what the gross receipts and the gross expenses were instead of net, but also that it's gone through the proper channels for approval. And kind of going back to the previous slide with the 3 areas of custody, authorization, and record keeping. We don't want to circumvent that by taking amounts out of deposits. Donor statements. Those are a very good financial control best practice because individuals can look at those and make sure that they're in agreement. So whether you do those annually, or some of you will even do those semi-annually or quarterly, if you do them more frequently, aside from the control benefit that it provides, it also can remind people, oh man, I missed a month this quarter, and they may make it up. If you get to the end of the year and they've missed 3 or 4 months, they're probably not going to make that up because it's going to be too large of an amount. But if you send them out a little more frequently, they may see that, oh, I missed a month, and catch that up. But putting donor statements in there with year-to-date amounts allows you to have a control that you have deposited the amounts that donors say that they have given. So the last point that I would have with the cash receipts is look at all the various ways that money comes in. It happens through a variety of ways. We've got camps for junior high. We've got women's teas. We've got men's retreats. We've got sometimes even, we might have athletic type things involved in the church as well. So where are those different places that money is coming in? And have we looked at the controls for each one of those areas? Some of you have gone to a lot of online registration, which has cut out a lot of the risk related to this. But it's so easy. I think at any given point in time, you can probably go to a youth department and find in the desk drawer somewhere, checks that were given for something that just haven't been turned over to the office. So it's not uncommon at all. Really look at where those funds come from and what controls you've got for them. Next, let's look at the cash disbursements examples. Don't pre-sign checks. I know that you've got the risk that we've got 2 check signers and they're both going to be out of town, but it becomes an easy habit to say, if I just keep 5 or 6 of these signed checks around, then I don't have to bother you. Well, that's part of that role and responsibility, is to be bothered. We need to make sure that we're not leaving ourselves open to risk there. Invoices should be reviewed and approved before payment. Really look at those. Did someone actually order that? And why? And was it approved? And is it the right amount? Those are all controls that'll make sure that we're not spending funds either because there was a mistake in billing, and I'm sure many of you have detected that before, or that it was something that the church shouldn't even be paying for, that a volunteer or a staff member really was using funds inappropriately. And that's where gray areas come in. You probably have been challenged or concerned about some of the purchases that are made, but if people know that we're looking at them, it minimizes some of those questionable charges as well. Review of canceled checks. We should have someone that is outside the day-to-day processing that's reviewing canceled checks, making sure that the utility company isn't being paid for, 2 different utility bills a month, that payees haven't been altered. So if we've got a good process in place for signing checks, that they're not going back to the preparer and then being altered after that fact. So that's why you would have the review of canceled checks. And then this is one you probably laugh at if you've read ahead. Do check signers take their responsibility seriously? They absolutely need to. They need to understand that it's not a formality for the bank, but that it is truly a control for the church, and that they need to be looking at the supporting documentation and making sure that that's an appropriate expense. No checks made out to cash. Those just put you at greater risk. Even if it's a petty cash reimbursement, that can be made out to an individual like any other expense reimbursement would. Along those same lines, we need to make sure that we're reconciling petty cash. We don't just write a check for $150 to true it back up to our $200 balance and move on. We need to reconcile that with the underlying receipts and invoices that are attached, and then code that to the right expense accounts, not miscellaneous or petty cash, but that they're going to the correct expense account from a budgeting standpoint. And then the last point I have on here is think about the fact that church credit cards need to have the same controls as any other expenses that we've discussed. Expense reimbursements or just expenses of the church. We need to have those controls in place. A few of you just laughed and rolled your eyes when you looked at this, because you know that you've got people that abuse that. They don't turn in receipts. They don't code things. They probably, some of them don't even get approval for it before they buy it, but now it's on the church credit card and it's got to be paid for. Really, the one thing that you can do about it is you can warn people, and then you can take their credit card away. And this is where, again, going back a couple of slides previously, tone at the top is so important. And that the people at the top are supportive of that, and that they understand how important it is for individuals to really respect that process and get the correct approval and get the correct receipts in. And it usually only takes taking one credit card away for A, that individual to comply in the future, and B, everybody else who knows about it to make sure that they are very compliant. And I'm not making this up. I've seen it work in different organizations, and it's harsh, but it happens and it works well. So good luck with that. Here's some payroll examples. We want to make sure that there is a review of payroll before it's processed, which a lot of people do to make sure that they've got a second set of eyes, that everyone's being paid properly. But the problem with that is that you also need that person to look at it after it's been processed. Because if I'm the one preparing payroll and I have Eric look at it and he agrees with it, signs off on it, and then before I actually submit it for processing, I go back in and change my pay rate or add hours to my payroll, he's not going to know that. So we need that person to look at it after it's processed also. Someone should review payroll changes. You know, that payroll change report should be pretty small. We've added an employee, we've taken out an employee, we've changed a pay rate. That really shouldn't be happening frequently, so it should be easy to review those payroll changes. We also want to make sure that we're reconciling the W-2s or the 941 quarterly reports to payroll expense. This has been one way that misappropriation or financial fraud has been detected in several churches because those amounts didn't reconcile. They were taking funds inappropriately through payroll, but making sure that they didn't go over in their payroll expense budget line. So when they coded the payroll into the accounting system, they bury a little of it in supplies, and they bury a little of it in postage, and they bury it around. But when you went to do the 941 reconciliation, all of a sudden wages and salaries were significantly higher than what those expense lines were in the accounting system, and that's how it got detected. So we want to make sure that we're reconciling that. And then certainly we need to have careful compliance with all the laws and regulations. And in this area, there are many. There are many federal laws and regulations, and there are many state laws and regulations. I've listed a couple here just to kind of, prime your brain for thinking about, but exempt versus non-exempt, or kind of salary versus hourly employees, employees versus independent contractors, maintenance of employment files. So how do we keep I-9s? What do we do? Some of you may actually reimburse for medical costs, which also the whole medical insurance arena is always changing, and we need to stay on top of that. But if you happen to, for any reason, maybe you administer your own flex spending account for the church, if there is any reason why you receive any medical information, even if it's a receipt from a doctor's office, you now have to comply with the HIPAA standards. And if you've been to the doctor in the last 5 years, you know that that's what you have to sign all the time, because they're making sure that you're aware of how they handle private information like that. This would put you at risk for having to do that as well. And those compliance standards are very high. So I strongly suggest that if you're in an area like that and there's regulations related to it, that you outsource that as much as possible. But those are just the types of things that I want you to be aware of and thinking about. A lot of laws and regulations related to payroll. So aside from the segregation of duties, let's look at the risk assessment. We're going to kind of step back a little bit and take a little broader overview. You should have a risk assessment at your church, and by that, it's really inherent in the name. What are the risks that your church has? And that assessment would start with your leadership, business administrator, treasurer, pastoral staff, ministry leaders. I tend to do this in some of the seminars that I teach, and I take a couple of white sheets of paper and markers, and I say, 2 minutes, go. Everybody in this room, tell me what you've got for risks. And in 2 minutes, we can literally come up with 3 pages. If you take your leadership team like this and you brainstorm for an hour, I think you'd be amazed at how in-depth and comprehensive that list of risks would be. So identify what those risks are, and then review it with governance, making sure that your board, whether it's trustees, elders, whoever the session, whoever that group might be, that you've reviewed those risks with them. You need to consider all areas: financial, legal, HR, facilities, reputational risk. What are the risks that we have to the reputation? Reputational risk is probably one of the most significant, because if there is a lapse there, it's going to affect nearly every area that's prior to that: financial, legal, HR. And it also, in many organizations, has the ability to bring it down or close that church faster than anything else. So what are those risks? Brainstorming each of those. And I think Eric and the Guide One team can help in areas like that. You can get other resources for that through Church Executive, but look at what do we need to do with risk. And then once you've identified all those risks, you're going to look at them and prioritize them. There's the risk that I might have something happen that's going to cost me $5 to fix. Okay, well, that's going to be towards the bottom of the list. There is a risk that the entire offering for Sunday could walk away. You know what? That's a bigger risk. We're going to put that at the top. Prioritize those by looking at the risk and the outcome of that, and then determine what your mitigating controls are. For some things, you're going to insure. For some things, you're going to have dual control or segregation of duties. There are some of them that you'll want to just look at and say, you know, is this a process issue? Do we just need to have a policy in place related to this? But I would encourage you to do that. And then last, review and update this annually. Things change. And we can't do this, put it on a shelf and say, sweet, the risk assessment's done. I'm not going to be on the board 10 years from now, so I've got that taken care of for my term. That's not the way it works. We need to make sure that that's being updated, just like we do the segregation of duties. And we should have documentation of the processes that we have in place for cash receipts and cash disbursements and payroll. Someone else may need to come in and do that. We may have a medical situation that takes us out for 4 to 6 weeks. We need to make sure that payroll can still be processed. So having procedures manuals in place is also part of that, and those should be reviewed and updated on a consistent basis as well. Here are some staff-related matters for financial control best practices. We need to properly vet new hires. We need to make sure that there isn't anything that we're aware of in their background that would make them an improper fit. We need to provide training. I am so encouraged that you are on this webinar today because you have taken an hour of your time to hopefully get some good training that you'll have a couple of things you can walk away from and say, we need to change that, or we need to do this. Training is really critical. We're in the dynamic environment and things are changing, and we need to be on top of those changes. We need to invest in our people. And as you've seen from today's webinar, it doesn't mean that it has to cost thousands of dollars, that we need to get degrees, or we necessarily need to send people, you know, away to another state for a week-long training program or something like that. It can be just through some ongoing webinars, but make sure that we're investing in people, that we're making them aware of opportunities for training and encouraging them to take part in that. We really need to provide appropriate compensation. And appropriate compensation doesn't mean it's the same as if they were in a for-profit business down the street, but it means that we do need to take care of our employees. Bonding is something that you may consider so that you've got insurance if a person does commit financial fraud. I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about that, but that there are certain factors that you have to consider even if you're going to do that. And the one that I always point out is you need to have a discussion with the church board about what would we do if financial fraud occurred in our church. And we'll talk about that a little bit more with the responding to fraud in a moment, but we've got to consider that. And then we need a policy for reporting fraud. Here are a couple of policies that we also should have in place: a whistleblower policy, a conflict of interest policy. We should consider having an audit or an external review of our financial statements, or at least our processes. Maybe you're not the size organization that needs to have an annual audit, but you certainly should have someone who is very knowledgeable in churches that can look at the processes that you have in place and the internal controls that you have in place and give you suggestions or an outside perspective on whether it's effective or not. You've probably all written a paper before, read it, and it said exactly what you thought it should say, and someone else looked at it and realized that you had 3 typos in there because you knew what it was supposed to say. Well, this is the same thing. We need an external perspective so that they can look at it and point out where we may have missed something. And then, what do you know? Tone at the top. I told you this is going to keep coming up. But we really need to make sure that we're setting the right tone and expectations for all of the staff and volunteers. So moving on to the last area on our agenda, we want to recognize and respond to fraud. The Association of Fraud Examiners puts out a report every other year. So this was the 2016 report to the nation summary. They look at fraud that occurs in organizations, from nonprofits to the largest of the for-profits. And in there, the median loss was $150,000 and was the same for small and large organizations. That's concerning because $150,000 in your church is probably a much bigger deal than $150,000 to some of the larger corporations that experience loss. The most common detection method was tips, followed by management review, internal audit, and look at that one, and by accident. I think the percentage, I'm within 1%, I think. Audits detect, excuse me, about 3%. So some of you may say, well, we have an external audit. That's an internal control. That is definitely not the only thing that you need to have in place. Tips was 39%. People know when things are going on around them, and we need to give them an environment where they can feel safe to raise those questions and that they can be researched without creating a problem for the person who had the concern or the person that was called into question, because it may not be an accurate assumption or accusation. We need to follow through on those. Lack of internal controls occurred in almost 30% of the cases. So that's where I was saying you have the opportunity to prevent the opportunity to commit fraud. 41% of those cases were not reported to police. Here's why I said you need to determine in advance of any fraud occurring what you will do and how you will handle it as a church. When there is a person involved, it now becomes personal. So we need the church leadership to determine, if this happened, what would we do? We would, notify the police, we would seek reconciliation, whatever that might be. You're going to have people on the polar ends, opposite ends of that discussion. But you can work through it when it's not emotionally charged. When there's a face and a person and a family in the church that's involved in this, it now becomes so difficult. And the point that I was going to make with bonding is that if you determine not to report it to the police, which is common, people don't want their church to be in the paper, and so they want to deal with this in a Christian way, and they want to seek reconciliation and not make it public. Well, most of the time, if you have bonded the individual, that policy is not going to pay out if you don't report it. So be aware of that so that you're making wise decisions on potentially bonding as well as how you would handle it afterwards. The other thing that I would say on not reporting it is at least consider the fact that if that person goes to another church or another organization and actually does the same thing, how would your church feel about having not taken steps to, in essence, warn that organization? And I have seen that happen. So we need to be aware of that. Behavioral red flags existed in 79% of the cases of fraud that they included in this survey. And by behavioral red flags, I mean things like living beyond their means. One of the church fraud cases that I'm aware of, a person had a struggling business, yet they were taking multiple vacations to Hawaii. And someone said, that's unusual. Financial difficulties. Again, in this case, they had a struggling business on the side, family-owned business. That provided a lot of financial difficulty for them. Excessive control issues. They won't let anyone else do their job. And it's not that they're just so nice and so gung-ho. They're very adamant about it. I'll take care of that myself. Last point I've got on here, lack of vacation, is kind of related to that excessive control. They may not go on vacation. Those most dedicated employees are maybe the most dedicated because they know that if someone else was in there doing their job, they detect what happened. And I don't want you to have a cloud of suspicion over everyone that you work with, but I do want you aware of these. What I just said on the previous slide, 79% of fraud cases, there were behavioral red flags that existed. Recent divorce or family problems, attitude change, these are all behavioral red flags that we need to be aware of. If there's a possibility that fraud has occurred, we need to deal with it and not avoid it. We need to make sure that we are taking care of due diligence, seek expert help, make sure that you get an attorney involved early on. If it truly looks like it will have been fraud, I would encourage you to get a certified fraud examiner, because if there's a chance that this is going to be a legal action, you want to make sure that you've preserved the evidence and that interviews have been conducted in the right way. You don't want to make any assumptions, good or bad. They wouldn't have done that. They're a nice person. They've been here a long time. They're a trusted member. You can't make that assumption. You also can't assume that the information to date is correct and that person has done something. No assumptions. You need to go into it, and sometimes having an external, third party makes that easier to avoid assumption. Limit the number of people that are involved. It's just going to create more chaos and more difficulty the more people that are involved. You do need to make sure that the governing board is aware after initial steps have been taken. You do not want your board of trustees or elders to find out through the rumor mill that something like this is going on. Make sure, even if it is just, this is a confidential matter, we're investigating this, we don't know at this time, we'll give you more information when we have it. Don't let them be caught by surprise. If it's true, two things. One, learn from it. How did it happen? How can we put policies in place or procedures in place to prevent it in the future? The second thing I would say related to that, unfortunately, is if it's true, however much the person might confess to, or you might find in your initial investigation, is probably significantly more than that. I have, again, been around this 20 years, and in many cases, the individual who was perpetrating the fraud was honestly actually surprised at how large the amount was, because they had been doing it and not even necessarily been aware of how much they had taken over time, and it was a much more significant amount. So when they say, yeah, I think it was about $5,000, I never, it's sad, but I just never believe that, because it's usually significantly more. In summary, just a couple of thoughts here. I think as stewards of resources that we have, we can't assume that finances are going to be handled properly. We have the responsibility to protect the church, and as I've said throughout, the individuals involved also. This means we've got to be proactive with our risk assessment, with our internal controls, then monitoring, making sure that those controls that we have in place stay in place, that we haven't lost something through that telephone game. And good communication is critical amongst our staff and volunteers. It doesn't need to be an onerous process. We just need to be thorough and consistent. My last point, make sure your congregation has done all it can do to pass the front page test. By that, what I mean is, if your church does something great, if you're reaching out to the community and you're making an impact, you're going to make the front page of the local section, or maybe the front page of the religion section. If you look at churches that make the front page of the paper in America, it's almost always because something bad happened. So let's make sure we can pass the front page test. With that, Eric, I'm going to hand it back to you and let you take us through some Q&A time.
Thank you so much, Vanna. Yes, we've had a number of questions that have come in. I've tried to group them into categories. The first, we had a series of questions about this webinar and about the notes or PowerPoint deck. So just two things on that. First, church executive will be making a recording of this webinar available, and the PowerPoint presentation pretty shortly, I would think by the end of the week, although Rayanne, perhaps you can address that at the end. Then also, Guide 1 will be sending out to all registrants information on the webinar, the recording, the slide deck, and then some additional financial resources. So that will be coming out to you as a registered participant within the next week. So the recording will certainly be available if you want to share with others on your staff or volunteers. The first topic, Vanna, has to do with cash, and there was some reference to this, but specifically any tips for handling cash on the Sunday offerings, and then a related question about petty cash within the office.
Okay, well, the thing I would say with the amounts that come in during Sunday, have two people count them, count the cash, and have them both sign off on a count sheet. And then, to me, my preference, if it's going into a safe where we've got dual control, that's great. If not, let's make sure that it's at least going into one of those sealed bank bags, kind of the ones that are like the FedEx envelopes, so that nobody else can get into that and take it without it being detected. So make sure that you've got two people signing off on that count. As far as petty cash, I would encourage you to keep as minimal of an amount as possible on hand. I've seen some places that, they have $1,000 of petty cash. Well, in most of our churches, even if they're large, we just don't need that much. So let's keep it to a minimum, and then make sure that when that's reconciled, that periodically, maybe once a quarter, somebody outside of the person that's reconciling it is looking at that reconciliation, that they're recounting the petty cash, they're looking at the reconciliation, and making sure that those things tie out. So we've got that second person involved in that process, even though they don't need to be involved on a day-to-day basis.
Great, thank you, Ivana. Going from cash to what more and more churches are doing in terms of online giving and/or online payments, the questions come in about how do we develop a standard operating procedure for our online giving process when only one person handles the process?
There are a couple of things with that. Probably the biggest risk that I see there is the change in the bank account. So online giving is processed by an organization and then deposited into the bank account. We need to know who has access to change the bank account that can be directed to, because it would be impossible that gets changed for 3 or 4 days and then changed back. So it would be great if the board treasurer or someone like that had the ability, if they were the only ones that could change where those funds went to, and that person was then separate from the one who was actually downloading all of the transactions, putting them into the donor system, et cetera, doing those batches. If that's not the case, then they should at least have someone else who has read-only access that can get in and look at what were the amounts that came in. So looking at those donation reports from the online giving module, and then comparing those to deposits in the church bank account. And again, that's something that could be done quarterly. It might take an hour once a quarter to look at the total giving report for the online giving system and compare that to the 3 months worth of bank statements. So having a second person, not in the day-to-day, but that has the ability to do some reconciliation and just look at that. The one thing that you have to be careful of is the reason that I'm intentionally saying they should have access to the donor system is because it's easy to alter reports. So if the person who's doing the day-to-day is the one that says, yeah, I'll run that report for you out of the donor system, they do that, they modify it, and then give them the report, of course it's going to tie. So we need to kind of take that second step and think through how someone could kind of trick the system. But if you get direct access to it, that would be my suggestion.
All right, a somewhat related question, Vonna. It relates to what type of insurance coverage you'd recommend for a church that has an online giving program. And this was a early attendee question, so we discussed that as an insurance company, it made sense for me to respond to that on behalf of Guide 1, and that would be to talk to your insurance broker or agent regarding the insurance coverages. There's a crime and employee dishonesty or fidelity bonding, as Vonna has mentioned before, that you want to consider. And then for the online piece, when there's online giving and or online payments being made, you may want to talk to your agent or broker about what's called cyber liability insurance coverage, which typically includes protection for electronic funds, fraudulent electronic funds transfer liability. So you might want to consider that. On a few related questions about audits, and we know there's a significant expense in having that done, and you did mention that a little bit, but I'll try to do this 3 in 1 if that's possible. One is, how does the church go about finding an independent auditor? How often should they be done, and when are they absolutely required?
All right. If I missed one of those, you take me back to it and I'll make sure and hit it. Finding an auditor, here's my most important point for this. Don't just find a CPA that does audits. You've got to find someone who understands churches. You have uniquenesses. No other business takes a Sunday offering. Okay? No other business besides nonprofits has restricted funds that come in that need to be spent for that purpose. There are unique things in the church, and you need to have a partner in your auditor that understands that. So that's where organizations like, the Church Network or ECFA, Church Executive Guide 1, and Guide 1 works with a number of CPA firms in different locations too, or is aware of them. Network with people. Check with other churches that are doing audits, but definitely make that your key criteria. As far as how often to do it, if there's a need, and this kind of ties in with, are we required to? I'm going to answer those two questions together. If you have a requirement, and what would require it? Oftentimes a loan covenant. Oftentimes it's your bylaws. It may be something that's denominationally driven. So if there's a requirement to have an audit, it should be done annually. If you're not required to have an audit, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, I think it's important to have a third-party independent person that looks at your information. A review is lower in scope than an audit, so therefore it's less costly because audits are expensive. And I understand that. I did audits for 20 years. I understand. Let's use the resources as effectively as we can. So if you can do a review instead, that may be helpful. And to me, for many churches, the most important thing is to have someone come in and look at processes. When I was at Cape and Krause, we had a product that we called the consulting review. And we looked at areas like tax and compliance. We looked at board governance and administrative matters. We looked at your financial reporting or internal controls. So we'd look in depth at certain areas. Do you have good internal control? So as you work with CPAs that are very knowledgeable in churches, they should be able to help you identify the level of service that you need.
A little different question relating to church treasurers, and that's about the church treasurer as independent contractor. Why or why not?
Interesting. I've heard of several positions being independent contractors, but not usually the church treasurer. And the reason that I say that is because usually that's a board position. So it's almost always a volunteer. If they're looking at it kind of like the financial secretary or the business administrator, certainly could be an independent contractor. I would have no concern about that, except for make sure that they are truly an independent contractor. You're going to need to look and make sure they qualify for that, because oftentimes there's going to be much more of an employment type arrangement there. It's, unless they're doing this for 3 or 4 churches, something like that, they're doing it, from their own business, they're supplying all of their own supplies to do it, those sorts of things. It's possible that it's not even going to actually meet the criteria for that. But I don't have a problem. It's interesting. Churches on this call, I'm sure, vary from that person has to absolutely be a member of our church and fully involved, to there's the opposite end of the spectrum that says we want to hire someone that will not have anything to do with this church, that they will go worship somewhere else, and that they are completely independent. So it really, that's a philosophical question, but as far as being able to do the job, you could do that.
All right, I know we're running short on time here. I want to be sensitive to everyone's time, so we'll do one more question, and then we anticipate providing some follow-up in the future, whether through a blog post or something about some of the other questions that we've not been able to reach. But a couple of questions, Vanna, relating to churches writing checks to other nonprofits outside of the church, and do we need a receipt or any documentation to support the check, and or do we need to issue a 1099 if it's going to a nonprofit?
Oh, Eric, you can't end on that question. That's a long question. Here, I'll give you a couple of basics, but what I'm going to do is encourage those people that have that question to really seek out someone who's knowledgeable in this area, because I'm going to give my best attorney answer here, and I'm not an attorney, but it depends. So if you're giving those funds, let's say that we're supporting missionaries, and so we're giving to organizations like TEAM and SIM and Wycliffe and a number of notable missionary sending organizations. You can do that. It's not a problem. There's no 1099 required. it's very well known what they do, and that would be in furtherance of your purpose as a church, no issue there. If you are giving it to an individual, which I think we didn't get into that in this question, and if we did, that's certainly something I'm going to defer. You need to make sure that that's handled properly. So bottom line, missions organization or maybe another nonprofit in your community that's doing something to further your exempt purpose, you're good with that. Make sure that you're documenting why that's being done, and probably board approval would be most appropriate for that.
Thank you, Ivana. We've really had some good questions, and haven't reached all of them. Like I said, we'll try to do some follow-up on those questions. But just finally and very briefly, I mentioned that in August, Ivana will be joining the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, or ECFA, as Executive Vice President. Guide 1 has collaborated with ECFA for a number of years with the sharing of financial resources for churches. So, Ivana, if you wouldn't mind, could you just share for a minute or two about your new role at ECFA and what that organization can offer to churches?
Absolutely, and thank you. I am so excited. I've worked alongside them for years. We are at all the same conferences, and we have the same heart for ministries and churches. So ECFA has seen a record number of churches really pursuing accreditation in the last several years, and right now over 40 of the largest churches in America are accredited with ECFA. The thing that I love is they're working with the large churches. They're also working with the smallest of churches in America. And through a collaborative effort with the Lilly Endowment, they have received funds to be able to really ramp up that support of churches, which is fun. Church leaders really often share that ECFA is a great partner to help them demonstrate good stewardship. Everyone wants to know, how do we know what we're doing is the right thing? And it just gives donors kind of that added level of confidence when an organization adheres to the ECFA standards related to things like board governance, fundraising, and finances. But one of the things that I think everyone here needs to know is that ECFA has just launched what they call Church Excel, and it's a brand new free subscription portal with resources for churches of all sizes. So through a digital subscription, each month ECFA highlights an important church administration topic, kind of like we're doing here today, through a variety of resources. It might be ebooks or online courses or the Knowledge Center or whatever. So they've launched a separate website altogether at ecfa.church, and you can find the Church Excel program there. You can find other resources. But it's just a blessing for me to be able to be involved. And you ask what the role is. I think for most of us going into a leadership role like that, I know it's going to morph over time. But I'm going to have the opportunity to do a lot of speaking like this that I'm getting to do today, but also a lot of involvement with the member organizations, as well as looking forward to what resources do we need to provide and where are we headed kind of in the future as ministries and as churches, and being proactive about helping churches be prepared for the future, whatever that looks like. So it'll be fun.
Thank you, Ivana, and all the best to you in your new role, and for your time in joining us today and sharing your knowledge and experience with us. Thank you to everyone who joined the webinar today. Please be on the lookout for the follow-up information that will be coming to you by email. And we look forward to future sessions on important topics involving church safety and risk management. Now, Rayanne, back to you.
All right, well, thank you, Eric, Ivana, and thank you everyone for attending our webinar today. This presentation has been recorded, and we will, as Eric alluded to, let you know when it is available for viewing. We expect that to be posted within 24 hours. Please also keep an eye out for a wrap-up article featuring the high points of today's webinar in the July-August issue of Church Executive. We hope today's webinar has been an insightful resource for you and your ministries. On behalf of Guide 1 Insurance and Church Executive Magazine, we thank you for attending.